Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, you are having a wonderful day today. So, hopefully, this is the last time I am going to record this. I'm trying to release this video today. That way, a certain amount of people can see it. But there's just been a certain amount of bad luck things with this video, such as it not wanting to record. But let's hope that it does it this time. Anyways, let's get on with this. I'm here to talk about the Jake Paul versus Tyron Woodley fight, and I'm here to give you my fight review. I'm here to give you my input. Anyways, for those of you overall that did not hear the news, this fight now, of course, obviously has ended, and Jake Paul ended up getting a split decision victory over Tyron Woodley. Now, if you're asking me overall who I personally predicted to win this fight, I thought that it was very difficult to predict who was going to win this fight. Now, a certain amount of you, maybe before the fight, maybe you were going to say, well, what the hell is wrong with you? You should have bet on Tyron Woodley because Tyron Woodley is a, professionally trained mixed martial artist and he's a very decent striker. He is not someone like Ben Askren who overall really can't strike worth a damn. And all that is understandable, but I'm a person overall that has watched a certain amount of sports, and my two favorite sports just happen to be boxing and MMA. And if you've seen Tyron Woodley fight before, you know overall that he can be a decent striker. He obviously has got a lot of power. He can time certain shots very well. But Tyron Woodley also, at times, and a certain amount of people may disagree with me on this, what he really can be is the more technical version of Deontay Wilder. That's sometimes what Tyron Woodley can be. And a lot of people may disagree with me there. What I'm going to say is this. I think Tyron Woodley, he is a decent fighter, and he's always going to go down as one of the greater MMA fighters. But this fight, just like yesterday, that's a big part of the reason why, overall, in my opinion, Tyron Woodley is not going to be in the upper echelon of all-time greats. He's going to be probably within that top 50 to top 60 range, and some people may even think overall that that's a little bit too low of where I rank him in terms of my UFC greats. Listen, when we talk about the top 10 to top 20 all-time great UFC fighters, Tyron Woodley is not going to be there. I understand his title reign was decently impressive, but there's a big part of the reason why Tyron Woodley was not even really able to win a second out of that fight against Kamaru Usman. Because Kamaru Usman, who in my opinion right now is debatably the number one pound for pound fighter in all the UFC, Kamaru Usman is a very multi-dimensional fighter. And Tyron Woodley, with his striking and really with a lot of his style, has really been very one-dimensional for a very, very long time, especially with his striking. So that's why, am I surprised that Jake Paul won this fight? No, I'm not surprised that he won the fight at all. In fact, once again, I did predict Jake Paul to win this fight. I actually thought that he was going to win by knockout because the last time that I seen Tyron Woodley in a fight, period, was against Vicente Luque, who's a decent fighter, but I didn't think that Vicente Luque was going to be able to beat Tyron Woodley. At least I didn't think overall that Vicente Luque, who in my opinion was never really overly talented, at least compared to some of the upper echelon guys in that division, I didn't think overall that he should have beat Tyron Woodley. But Tyron Woodley allowed it because obviously he's not the same fighter that he used to be. And on top of that, he's just pretty much lost all confidence within himself. And I did not think that his chin was going to be there. And like I'll say is this, Jake Paul, in my opinion, he's never going to get, Best Boxer of the Year award. He's never going to get, the award for the best boxer. Like I said, Jake Paul, he's not an A-grade boxer, but he's also not the worst boxer that I've seen. Obviously he's had some training. Obviously certain professionals have trained him when it comes down to it, and he at least somewhat knows what he's doing. Now, obviously he's not going to beat Canelo or Earl Spence or Terrence Crawford or anyone like that. But when it comes down to it, is he going to be able to beat some of these MMA fighters? You bet your ass he will. Because some of these MMA fighters, they don't really know how to box that well. Ben Askren really doesn't have striking to speak of. Tyron Woodley has decent striking at times. At times, he also can be very, very one-dimensional. And if you've seen Tyron Woodley in several of his fights in the UFC, you know at times what I'm talking about. Tyron Woodley, like I said, he pretty much is the more technical version of Deontay Wilder. He knows how to counter a little bit better, I believe, than what Deontay Wilder does. He's not as sloppy as what Deontay Wilder is. But when it comes down to it, Tyron Woodley, at times what he'll really do is either press the action or back up and be on the back foot and try to land that right hand. That's mainly what he tries to do. He also has a very decent left hook, kind of like Deontay Wilder as well, but he doesn't use it as much as he probably should. there was a few good shots that Tyron Woodley got in here. Obviously, Tyron Woodley, I thought that he clearly won round 4. That is the only round overall that I thought Tyron Woodley won, to be honest with you. Like I said, once again, this was a split decision, which I thought was very generous towards Tyron Woodley because I did not think that this was a split decision at all. I thought that Jake Paul very clearly won this fight when it came down to it. I thought that Jake Paul won this fight, to be quite honest with you. I thought he won it 7 rounds to 1. I think that if you really, really wanted to be generous towards Tyron Woodley, and maybe if you were his wife, and if you were one of the professional judges in this fight, maybe you could have scored 3 rounds for Tyron Woodley. That's a big, big maybe. Maybe you could have scored round 4 or 5 and round 8 for Tyron Woodley. I would not even score the majority of those rounds for him. So it is what it is. There's only one round for sure I would have scored for Tyron Woodley, and that would have been round 4 where he nearly knocked Jake Paul down and obviously hurt him very badly with the right hand. Now, there is going to be some people that maybe ask me, do you think that this fight was fixed? Do you think overall that Tyron Woodley just did this for a payday? No, personally I don't, and a lot of people are going to disagree with me on that. I don't think that you try to hit each other the way that you guys did in that fight, and this fight is fixed. When a fight is fixed, you usually see something very clearly happening. You usually see a fighter overall that usually took a dive, kind of like how Malik Scott did against Deontay Wilder, where the punch did not even land and somehow he gets magically knocked out. Or you see something overall to where the fighter does not, one fighter does not throw anything whatsoever and the other fighter is just completely offensive. That's usually what a fixed fight is. Now, Tyron Woodley, when it came down to it, he was not extremely offensive in this fight, but he was offensive enough to where overall it looks very clearly like he was trying, in my opinion. So it is what it is. So do I believe that this fight was fixed? No, personally, I do not. I just think that Tyron Woodley has a certain amount of faults, and it was just even more exposed in this fight. So it is what it is. Once again, and a lot of people may think that I'm trying to caveat Tyron Woodley's title defenses and his greatness. I'm not trying to. Once again, Tyron Woodley is going to go down as one of the greatest fighters in the UFC's history. But there's a big part of the reason overall why he could not beat Kamaru Usman, in that fight, and why he could not even win a single second of that fight. Because Kamaru Usman is a very multi-talented fighter. He's a multi-dimensional fighter. Colby Covington as well. And Tyron Woodley is very lucky that Colby Covington did not get a hold of him overall before last year. Because in my opinion, Colby Covington, who's also a very multi-dimensional fighter, Colby probably would have beat down Tyron Woodley the same amount that he beat on him last year. So it is what it is. That's the bottom line. And one thing you notice about Tyron Woodley, usually when he won his fights in the UFC, it usually did not come against very multi-dimensional fighters. It usually came against Stephen Wonderboy Thompson, or a Damian Maia, or a Darren Till. Certain fighters overall to where in a lot of areas they can be very, very, very one-dimensional, and they usually only like to tend to fight in one sort of way. So it is what it is. When you have Kamaru Usman, who can do a multitude of things overall, that's when Tyron Woodley had a very, very, very difficult time of beating that guy, because Tyron Woodley, he at times can be very one-dimensional himself, especially in his striking game. And that's why I predicted Jake Paul to win this fight. Now, let me say this, because you're going to have a certain amount of people overall that, debate this, and there's going to be a certain amount of videos out there about this. I can already see them coming from a mile away, especially because a lot of these boxing channels, they're owned by the LDBC and New Media, which have their own racial bias agenda. They're going to be saying, well, Tyron Woodley, he clearly pressed the action, and, he was the one pressuring Jake Paul. So how come, they say Jake Paul, won this fight, and, how come they don't have the same standards, blah, 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 blah. Well, what I'm going to say is this, and some people might try to pull it with me, but I'm usually very consistent and logical once again with my fight breakdowns. Like, if you were trying to compare this with Guillermo Rigondeaux and the John Rio Casimero fight versus this fight, I don't think you can necessarily compare it to that because, like I said, being on the back foot is not always a bad thing. I'm not someone who criticizes a fighter just because they're on the back foot. Jake Paul, for this entirety of the fight, he pretty much was on the back foot the majority of the fight, if not the whole entire time. But he was the one pushing the action. Actually, really what this fight reminded me of was a lot of the Tyson Fury versus Deontay Wilder first fight. When it comes down to where Tyron Woodley, he seemed to have more power, but he was only trying to land mainly that right hand or that left hook when it came down to it. and overall he was pretty much getting outboxed mainly because of activity. That's really what this fight reminded me of. That's a very good comparison when it comes down to it, in my opinion. So it is what it is. But when it comes down to it overall, like I said, if someone were trying to compare this to Guillermo Rigondeaux versus John Rio Casimiro, you couldn't. Because Guillermo Rigondeaux, the reason why he lost that fight is because that's what he was doing. He was running. What Jake Paul did here was not running. Obviously, he was on the back foot, but he was clearly outboxing Willie. He was clearly outthrowing him. He clearly was active enough to the point to where you can give him points. Guillermo Rigondeaux, like I said, there were certain points in that fight to where a minute or a minute and a half would go by, and he would not even throw a single punch. And if you want proof overall about how little he threw and how little amount of punches that he landed, the amount of punches that those fighters combined landed in that fight when it came down to it, and that was a 12-round fight, that was a championship fight, they landed less punches and threw less punches, I believe, overall than what both Tyron Woodley and Logan Paul did in this fight, and this was only an 8-rounder. So that should tell you everything that you need to know right there. It is what it is. Anyways, when it comes down to the overall, what I'm going to say is this. I'm not surprised that Jake Paul ended up getting the decision. I thought that he clearly won the fight. It is what it is. In my opinion, Tyron Woodley, he probably should have done a little bit better, but I don't know if he has the capability because, once again, if you've watched Tyron Woodley for his career, you know at times he can be very one-dimensional with his striking. As for Jake Paul, what do I think is next for him? I'm not necessarily sure. I've heard rumors overall maybe he could face Tommy Fury, who I was not particularly impressed with, by the way, earlier on the card, but it is what it is. In fact, I think the person who had the most impressive performance probably was that new fighter overall that I seen face against Ivan Baranchek. I don't remember his name, but that kid overall certainly is now on my radar. He's an undefeated fighter. He did very, very well. Baranchek, in my opinion, he's not really an A or a B class fighter. He's a C class fighter, but he is someone who's decently tough. And, you know, for someone overall who's never really faced anyone that elite, at least that I know of, for him to outbox him the way that he did and knock him out to the point to where Pedro, I believe is that coach's name, to where he had to stop it, that was decently impressive. So it is what it is. As for Jake Paul, what do I think overall he should do? I would actually like to see a fight versus him and Masvidal. Masvidal is a very decent striker. Maybe he could possibly have a chance at a boxing match, and that would do a lot of money because Jorge Masvidal has a very big fan base. He's pretty much kind of like a Nate Diaz-like figure. So it is what it is. Anyways, that would be very interesting. We'll see what happens. As for Tyron Woodley, I think he pretty much should ride off into the sunset, but whatever he does is whatever he decides to do. You know, these guys get paid a lot for these boxing matches. So it is what it is. Certainly more than they ever would in the UFC. So it is what it is. Anyways, that's really about it for today. Thank you so much for watching. I'll talk to y'all later, and we'll see where this goes.